We've since met him in Greece, New York. I've done 10 front row seats in Greece, New York, and Canada, New York when I was here.
Wow.
Okay, we're rolling.
Okay, this is an interview at the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society, Buffalo, New York, 25th of October 2006, approximately 2:30 p.m. Interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Jack D. Lang, born in Buffalo, September 18th, 1942.
Okay. What was your educational background prior to entering service?
I was a Buffalo Grammar School kid. I started at 23. I went to 78 and graduated, moved out to Tonawanda, went to Sweet Home Junior High for a year, Amherst High School for a sophomore. Came back to Sweet Home, which they were building a senior high for junior-senior years. On graduation, I went to Buffalo State Teachers College, where I graduated with a BS in Education, majoring in Secondary Social Studies, 1964.
Graduated 63.
Fellow Buffalo State there.
Yes.
Are you military too?
No.
Well, I was going to say we have a military reunion coming up, alumni military reunion coming up November 3rd, I guess, 3rd or 5th, whatever, Saturday.
Okay, did you enlist or were you drafted?
I was going to be drafted, so I had enlisted in the Air Force. Had a date of early January 1965, and found out I was going to be drafted in August. So I went down and saw my recruiter, and we signed up in the Air Force. I went to basic training in November of '64.
Okay, why did you select the Air Force?
It seemed like probably publicity-wise, it may have been, I wasn't even fly high back then. It was just something different. I guess I had some friends. It's mostly hearsay, and upon learning more about the Navy and the Army and the Marines since then, they're all wonderful organizations. Just because I suppose I picked it out of a hat.
Okay.
And going on from there, I got out of basic training. I went to officer training school.
Whereabouts was that?
I went to basic training in San Antonio, Texas at Lackland Air Force Base. I moved across the Medina part of the base at Lackland in January of '65 through the end of March, where I went through officer training school. That made basic training a little bit different. I think of myself as the old man in basic. I think I was 22 and the rest of the kids were 17 and 18.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember the sergeant there, Sergeant Arthur Herbert, as a matter of fact, the first day, saying, "I understand there's a college graduate here amongst us," and one hand went up, which I've since learned you don't have to volunteer for a lot of things. "And I understand there's going to be somebody upon leaving here going to be going to officer training school," and again one hand went up. Well, I was told at that point, "Congratulations, son, you're the latrine queen." So that was my initial job in the Air Force in basic. Basic, it did wonders for me. It got me, I guess, to reality as far as military way of life. I'd gone from being a single guy living at home, all of a sudden with a bunch of guys in barracks, and you start to work with a team. You have to get through. And learning the basic parts of military life made officer training school so much easier when I went through. I didn't worry too much about that as much as academics. And because I had, I guess, quote unquote, a little military background at that time, I wound up being a distinguished military graduate at officer training school. And that got me a regular commission, as opposed to what do you call the other one anymore?
Reserve?
Reserve officer, yeah. I had my regular commission.
Okay, after you received your second lieutenant, as far as where did you go from there?
From there I went to Moody Air Force Base. I guess I can jump backwards a little bit yet.
Okay.
When I was in college, I took the AFOQT, Air Force Officers Qualification Test, I guess they call it. And I happened to be on a canoe trip in Canada with a friend of mine who was a navigator. And in talking, he said, "Hey Jack, you're taking that exam, why don't you take the pilot, the flying part of it?" And I said, "I've never been in an airplane." He says, "Hey, you don't have glasses. I could only be a navigator, I have glasses." So I said, "Hey, cool." So I take it. It was another 2 hours on the exam. It made it 5 hours, I guess, instead of 3 or whatever. And I qualified to go to flight school and never having been on an airplane. I thought that was kind of cool too. As a single guy, you know, a lot of things pretty cool. So when I got out of OTS, we went to the Medina side of the field, as I mentioned, for officer training school. That was for pilots and navigators to be, or wannabes.
How long was that school you went through? The initial phase of it?
OTS was 3 months. Undergraduate pilot training was 55 weeks.
And what kind of aircraft did you train
I
in?
was in the last class of pure jet aircraft. I started in a T-37, which is a twin-engine jet. They called it the Tweety Bird. Had one hell of a racket, a real whine to it. We flew that for 6 months, and then we graduated, moved up to primary school in a T-38. T-38 is still in use today by the astronauts, still in use for pilot training. It's the white rocket, they call it. It used to be like driving a Jaguar. I guess it still is, but there's Maseratis around now that do a lot better. It was a wonderful airplane to fly, and that's what I eventually instructed into. So anyway, 55 weeks of schooling. Your day was spent half a day in academics and a half a day flying, and you alternated weeks. My class started with 46 of us folks in it, and to go to flight school, you had to be, to go to OTS, you had to be a college graduate. To go to flight school, you had to be a college graduate commissioned officer. We started with 46 in my class and graduated 28. We had one young fellow, a good friend of mine, died in a plane crash. It was just before our first solos, and I believe 3 or 4 guys SIE'd or self-induced elimination the following Monday. When the realization came that this isn't all fun and games, it's a lot of work, and could be, just because we were stateside, death is there. So we graduated probably 60% of my class. And your assignment came by where you graduated in the class. There were 8 pilot training bases at the time. Laughlin, Texas, Del Rio, Texas, Selma, Alabama, where we were in Wheaties, in Valdosta, Georgia. The top graduate in each class got his choice of assignments, and after that, when the assignments came in, if there were 120 graduates, there were 120 assignments, and you drew by your place in the class. If you were first, you got the assignment you wanted. If you were second, they went to second at each base, third at each base, fourth at each base. I was high enough to get an instructor slot. It was my second choice. My first was a WC-130. It was a prop plane, but it was weather. I was always interested in weather. I think there were only 1 or 2 assignments there. It kind of went faster. I got the instructor slot, and then I wound up in a T-38, which was perfect for me. For a guy that, I guess, when I went through undergraduate pilot training, I mentioned the washout rate. At least one of the guys was a Cornell aeronautical engineer that had 300 hours flying time before he got into the service, and he was a washout. And here I was with no flying experience at all. But I think back then it was the Air Force way. It was the only way to fly. I think sometimes you wanted the habits maybe that weren't quite conducive to what Uncle Sam was looking for.
So your first assignment then was as an instructor, where you
I graduated, I got my instructor slot at Moody. I went to Randolph in San Antonio, Texas. It was the 3rd time I'd gone to San Antonio. And this was a charm, by the way, because I met my wife-to-be when I was out there a week before I came back to Moody.
Was she in the military?
No, she was. I went to church on a Sunday morning to hear a cousin of mine who was an intern minister. I wound up at a church picnic that afternoon, and I wound up tubing down the Guadalupe River with a young lady that was hanging out on my big toe. Lo and behold, about 1.5 years later, we got married. And we still are. We just got back from Hawaii a couple weeks ago and celebrating our 39th anniversary is coming up, and it was a nice trip to be there. The flight school itself, I found probably is more difficult than anything I've ever gone through in my life. I mentioned earlier that it was a half a day of academics and a half a day of flying, and the academics consisted of aeronautical engineering, Air Force physiology, Air Force doctrine, counterinsurgency, physical training, just a variety of weather classes, navigation classes, and then the afternoon flying bit. I can still remember the first day I was out of the T-37 with my instructor, Captain Robert Martin. We went out to look at the T-37, and as we're leaning in, I looked and I said, "Where's the steering wheel?" And he just raised his eyes and rolled them a little bit and said, "Oh my God, I got one of these." However, about 12 flying hours later, I was solo in a T-37, and that was kind of awesome. The first time to a solo in a T-37, you learned how to land, take off, and basic emergency procedures, aircraft control, and then one day when you were flying, your instructor would have you land, and he'd get out and say, "Go out and give me 3 landings." And you did that, and you patted yourself on the back. It was your first solo. And the second time, you did basically the same thing, and the second time, you say, "This is no problem at all." Almost disaster can happen because you get a little cocky, and then you realize that it's one of those jobs that you have to pay attention to what you're doing if you want to survive. After solo in the T-37, we wound up going through the navigation phase, little formation phase, so the navigation phase. As I said, we flew it for 6 months, or I think about 120 flying hours. T-37 was a subsonic. It went, I think, 0.8 Mach, approximately 400 knots maximum speed. Besides learning aircraft control and procedures, we had learned how to spin. And if you've ever been on a spin or ever been, I always liked roller coasters, and this was the wildest ride. I'd gotten in an inverted spin one day with my instructor, and it was the wildest gyration, spinning around a point upside down, just going and to break out of it. Built your confidence up too. It was hard to get in, but if you got in, knowing how to get out was wonderful. Unlike a T-38, we didn't have spin practice. They said if you got in they got in one spin in the T-38, and all the practice type testing stuff that they did, and they got out with a drag chute, and we didn't have a drag chute in ours. So the answer was, if you ever got in one, you're gone. You're saying bye-bye and punching bailing out. Anyway, after the 6 months in the T-37, you moved up to a T-38. I mentioned it was the White Rocket. You went to a different set of instructors. And here you had some Air Force background as far as flying. Now you were getting into the primary phase. First ride, they called it a dollar ride. I still got some of the dollars left for my students. If they signed, you'd take them up. T-38 would do 1.53 times the speed of sound, Mach 1.53. I've gone a little over 1,000 miles an hour at one time in it. It had twin afterburners. The dollar ride was a max climb to 40,000 plus feet. Level off, go supersonic, do some max deflection rolls to show the capabilities of the airplane. I'd bring it back, because at that point, with the max climb and the supersonic run, you're basically out of fuel. T-38 didn't carry a whole lot of gas. The average mission in that was probably an hour 5 to an hour 10. You could navigate, I think I've gotten as long as an hour 50. It's strictly a navigation phase where you're not doing much throttle jockeying at all. After that, you settle down to work. You flew, I think it was 11 instrument missions in the back seat under a hood to learn the capabilities, the controls, everything else about the airplane. And at that point, when you passed the mid-phase instrument check, you jumped from the back seat to the front seat. You changed seats with the instructor, and he began to learn about taking off and climbing and landing and doing maneuvers, everything from, I suppose, a lazy aid to an Immelman to a loop to a chandelle to a whatever. The speeds for these maneuvers varied anywhere from 200 to 500 knots. A lot of the maneuvers you see the Thunderbirds and the Blue Angels do, we did. And we did later in formation, but we had altitude restrictions. We weren't on the ground like these guys do today. But we do that with students, and some of them were solo students at the time. So it's kind of exciting at all times, plus a wonderful learning experience. After the dollar ride, after the initial instrument check, I think there were somewhere around 8 or 9 rides we flew in the front seat before we were cleared to go solo. And unlike the T-37, where the one day you were flying, you came in, dropped the instructor off, and went back out. If I were flying with you today, and I decided you could hack it, I cleared you solo, and you may not fly for a day or 2 or 3 days. Then you'd go up. And at that point, you went out to the airplane by yourself, did the pre-flight, did all the initial checks on it, taxied out, made the takeoff by yourself, everything. That day you went down to your area, and we had assigned areas to, I call them confidence builders at first, and what you were doing was going out to burn off a little bit of fuel so you could come back and get some landing practice. But you were going out to get some aircraft control, practicing some of your maneuvers also. You had areas that go barrels and buckets. I think the buckets were below flight level 230 or 23,000 feet approximately, and the barrels were above and a larger size. As I said, we usually take 10,000 feet to do an over the top and over a loop or an Immelman was not unusual, and that was with a 4G pull. Sometimes you could float it a little bit, not quite as much G pressure, and you could eat up 12, 14, 15,000 feet. So you had an assigned area, not only east, west, north, south, but vertically. You had a 10,000 or 12,000 foot block you had to remain in too. So kept you. After the contact flying phase, we got into more advanced instruments. Navigation learning came in where you began to fly some navigation flights, including cross countries. And that's where I began to be able to date my wife. I would take a cross country once a month, and the student could go any place he wanted to, basically in the States one night, and one night went to San Antonio. So, and San Antonio was a good place to go anyways for the kids. And then we got in the formation phase, and it started out 2-ship formation, you wound up with 4-ship formation. As I say, we flew our formation rides with solos. You had 3 feet wingtip clearance. We did over the top maneuvers. And it was to give, I think, to give the students confidence in what they were doing, knowledge of aircraft performance, things like that. Because when they graduated from us, they went on to their assignment, whether it be a fighter plane, whether it be a bomber, whether it be a transport. They went to school like I went to instructor school.
So basically, did you stay in the same base the entire time?
I wound up staying at Moody for the entire 4 years of my instructor slot. I was there for 55 weeks of my student pilot training. I wound up spending 5.5 years in the service. I think my outlook on things changed after I got married, after we had a baby come along. It was still fun. I enjoyed it. But your life styles change.
Mm-hmm. You lived off base with your wife?
Lived off base. We rented a duplex in the town of Valdosta, which was kind of a, I won't say it was a booming metropolis. We've gone down there a couple times since, and it's done a lot of growing. It used to be, I think, about 20,000 people, and the entertainment, I think on a Saturday night I was watching the freight train come through town. They did a show in town. They had a bowling alley in town. But the wives had wives clubs, and the guys got together. We had a golf course on base, and it was life. And it was kind of a nice life. Mm-hmm. I still get together with some of the instructors from those times. One of them's a farmer in Ohio. We see him 3 or 4 times a year. Another just retired from the military. He's living out in Fallon, Illinois. Another couple are just retired as Delta airline pilots.
Mm-hmm. And you knew someone that retired as a major general also?
Yeah, I believe, yeah. One of my classmates retired as a major general. We had a reunion back in May of this year, and Jeff Cliver, who was a lieutenant when I knew him, he was commissioned at, he might have been a RATSI commission, I don't think he was OTS. Found out he was a major general in his career he made, and 5 of the kids in my class wound up as full colonels. So we were a rank class. And one of my students, I guess, even got a little above Major General.
Oh, yes.
Would you tell us about him?
Okay. The class of 7004 was a young fellow named Lieutenant George W. Bush that came on through. He was a Texas Air Guard guy. Some of the memories, we're going back 35 years. If I can recall, he was the first in his class to solo. Does that mean you're the best? Well, we were all the best. To understand going through pilot training, I don't think there was anybody in the world that could keep up with us. I think the Air Force pilots, and since I learned Navy pilots, are pretty damn good too. But this is just personal experience that they were as good as anybody anywhere. Lieutenant Bush had I said he was Texas Air Guard. He had an F-102 assignment awaiting him when he got out. And I've never flown an F-102, but I've talked to a few people that have, and it took a lot to fly them. You weren't just a fly-by-night guy or just a la-di-da. You had to fly it and stay alive and do your job. You had to. You had to be good. Anyways, he graduated in, it would have been November of '69, I guess. And I got to meet his dad that day, and little did I know that I'd wind up shaking hands with two future presidents. I met a congressman from Houston named George H.W. Bush, who I had never met prior. I wasn't President Bush's actual instructor. I was the scheduling officer, the flying safety officer, the ground safety officer. And I flew with basically all the kids in the class to see. I was the senior instructor, I think, at that time. Basically the senior instructor. And I flew with everybody to see where they were, how their kids were doing. And I call them kids because they were men, kids, whatever. I guess I felt like an old guy at 20, 26, 27, somewhere. As I mentioned, just to go through the program, you had to be extremely top-notch. Sometime thereafter, I had occasion to contact former Lieutenant Bush, who was then, I think when I got back in touch with him, he was probably the owner of the Texas Rangers, or the president of the Texas Rangers. He was part of one, I guess. I started communicating with him then. And we've been communicating ever since. 2 weeks ago, his wife, our first lady, was in Buffalo, and my wife and I were lucky enough to be the only two citizens outside the Secret Service to meet her. Not even the press was allowed where she lands. I thought that was kind of awesome. When I was done, I heard she was coming. I made a phone call to the White House through one of the executive secretaries that I deal with, and it was set up. We've gotten to see the president in Canandaigua, New York, when he was there, I believe in March of this year. In Greece, New York, when he was there last year. And we've lucked out, I guess, with front row seats.
Mm-hmm.
And on these occasions, when the president's walked around the bandstand, each time he's looked up at a distance of anywhere from 3 to 8 feet. So Jack, I almost didn't recognize you without the hat because I'd worn a cowboy hat numerous times when I see him. Or, Jack, how's the Lang family doing? And to me, this is just awesome. He remembers a little old guy like me. I was a flight instructor. I mean, to toe-to-toe with him. We've been to one of his gubernatorial inaugurations. We've been to one of his presidential inaugurations. As I say, to me, people bitch and moan about the president. I find it hard to believe that anybody would want to be president anymore. Everything you do is so out in the open. But I think he's the greatest thing that's happening to our country because he's standing up for what America is for. Get off the politics.
Now you mentioned here on your website that one time you were out on a flight with him and you lost your radio.
Okay, that's on the. This is printed a little different. I know which page you're on.
Okay.
This is one of his guard troops. One of his guys that was in the Air Guard.
Oh, okay.
When they made this page up, they somehow overlapped part of my page and part of his page.
Oh.
I'm no one sorry about that.
Mm-hmm.
But I continue on with the long sheet. Here it is. This would be more. I do have a picture here, just an example. I don't really
Yeah, I can zoom right in on it.
We were called Wingman for Bush back on November 1st, 2004. We met in Pittsburgh, PA. It was the day before Election Day to support the president running for re-election. I was called by General Carl Schneider, who was out in Arizona at the time, to be there representing the 238s from Moody Air Force Base. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Twite was going to be there representing, he was a 237 flight commander. General Schneider was there, he was Deputy Commander of Operations at Moody when I was there. Retired Colonel Clarence Parker was the wing commander when I and President Bush were there. He was there also. And then two of the Texas Air Guard guys, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Campenny and Captain Joe Glavin, were there, along with two of the President's 7004 classmates, Randy Dahlberg and Paul Rep. So we made up what was finally called the Wingman for Bush. He acknowledged us 3 or 4 times in his speech that day, and we were ushered backstage after he got done to spend 5 or 6 minutes with him, which was awesome, because he was headed to 8 states that last day, and he had time for old friends. And I think this is what is so wonderful about the man, that he doesn't forget where he comes from. People say he's money. Well, I'm sure not money. People say he didn't go to Vietnam. I didn't go to Vietnam. Who did I know? Who did he know? I don't know. You know, it's Air Force had reasons to put people in various places.
Okay. Do you have any other remembrances that you want to add while you were in the service?
No, I think that's pretty much it. It was a fast 5.5 years. You don't realize it. I say, I wanted probably the biggest thing was finding my wife, and the mother of my children. And I don't put that above the Air Force. It's just one of the things that Air Force was nice for that. Did it make a man out of me? I guess it did. I became a father of 2 children. I was a police officer in the town of Tonawanda for over 24 years. Yeah, I was kind of a crazy college kid when I got involved with all of this kind of stuff, like most of us were back then. But I think when you get some discipline in you, you change, and I think the military has done that. In this case, the Air Force.
Did you make use of the GI Bill at all when you exited service?
No, and I'm sorry now in retrospect that I didn't. I probably should have gone on for a master's, but I was a new father at the time, a new job. And I didn't. I look at one thing, I guess I could have bettered whatever that was. But I became a family man. I guess I wanted to coach my kids' softball teams and this kind of stuff as the years went on. I was one of the few police officers that didn't work part-time. I think I worked 2 Christmases and I said, I don't want to do that. I enjoy being with the family. So.
Do you join any veterans organizations at all?
I'm a Legionnaire in the town of Tonawanda.
How do you think, I think you've reflected on this a little bit, how do you think your time in the service changed or had an effect on your life?
Well, as I say, I think it made, I don't know if saying made me a man, but made me a lot more responsible than I was in college. I guess a lot of people, and probably my children included, although you don't hear everything right away, maybe wasted a few hours playing bridge, learning how to play bridge, learning how to do this, do that, and got away from classes maybe that you should have spent a little more time with. I think when you got into service, or when I got into service with the classes, I was good at counterinsurgency and geography, classes like that, but when it came to aeronautical engineering, I was completely lost at first. And I really had to work hard at that kind of stuff, and I think that's where working with some of the other guys in the class, you begin to form camaraderie and do things that together that maybe you didn't do in the past. And I think that brings a little. Just
And of course you found your wife.
She doesn't want me to feel it.
All right, well thank you very much for your interview.